He needs protection. Well, and so now he has gotta go. So we're going to get started. This is Russell Rowland. He is here, as a Humanities Montana speaker, right?
Yeah.
Speakers Bureau, Montana Conversations. He has authored 6 books in a compilation. Anyway, 56 Counties is my favorite. It's my go-to when people ask for books about Montana. So if you've not read 56 Counties, I definitely recommend it. Russell Rowland.
Thank you. So I want to thank Emily for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming. So my mother grew up on a ranch in southeastern Montana in Carter County, just about 60 miles from Ekalaka, the county seat. And, we used to go there every summer, and occasionally they would leave me there. Just because it was a great experience. And, as a kid, when you live in a big city, we lived in Billings, so going to the ranch was a big deal. And, there was this one summer where I was there and my grandparents took me over to visit a neighbor, and they had a kid the same age as me that I had known my whole life. We'd hang out every now and then. His name was Kelly Corneman. And Kelly was just a fun kid to hang out with. He always had some tricks up his sleeve, things that we could do around the ranch. And so this day he asked me if I'd ever ridden a calf. And I said, oh, sure. But I never had ridden a calf, so I was lying. But my dad was a rodeo guy back in Bozeman when he was in college, so I just kind of figured, well, I could probably impart it, it's in my blood, right? So anyway, Kelly takes me out to the corral, and boy, he had the whole getup. He put me in shafts and spurs, and I had my straw hat already, so I'm all set to go. And he puts the calf into the chute, and I lower myself on the calf, get my hand under the bull rope, and I'm doing this because I've been to the rodeo, And he opens the gate and shoos the calf. The calf takes off, and for probably about 5 seconds, I was riding that calf. I thought I had it all down, and the calf suddenly comes to a complete stop. And I go flying over the calf, land flat on my stomach, and completely knocked the wind out of me. I was lying there. So Kelly comes running over, and he's freaking out. He rolls me over and he's crying, and we both thought I was gonna die, of course. And then all of a sudden he's down at my feet, pulling my boots off. And I was laying there going, what's he doing, Well, the whole time this is happening, his dad just happened to come along. So he was standing over by the barn just laughing at what was going on. And so for years, Donnie Cornerman used to love to tell the story of how Kelly wasn't about to let his friend die with his boots on. And these are the kinds of stories that I love about being a Montana kid, because it's just so unique from any other place. As far as I saw my dad sew up put a prolapsed cow's uterus back inside and sew it up, all this stuff that you don't see if you're growing up in any other place. I saw calves die, saw my dad skin a calf and put it on another calf so that mother who lost her calf would take that calf, and these are the kinds of experiences that really shaped me as a kid, and I think probably they're kind of a gift that Montana kids get that other places don't, where you get to see life and death, you get to learn how to deal with tragic moments, and but also, you know, just disappointment, like getting bucked off a calf, you know. And here's one of the funnier things too about that story is that for years I told that story, and then I would say, and I never got out on a calf again. And it was kind of my way of saying, you know, this scarred me for life. But, you know, after a while, I realized I rode calves a lot after that. I was completely reshaping my own story to serve some kind of, you know, make some kind of point. But the truth is, yeah, I learned, like most kids do, that when you get bucked off a calf or a sheep or a horse, you just dust yourself off and get back on. So I decided I was gonna be a writer kind of late compared to a lot of people. I was in my 20s, and I was just going through a divorce, and I had just lost my grandmother, who was the matriarch of this ranch where my mother grew up. My grandmother Arbuckle was widowed twice before she was 35. She had 4 kids under 12, and she met Frank Arbuckle, and he married her and brought those kids up just like they were his. My mother had the way she described it, you know, it's pretty idyllic, but I know that's not really true. But it was a pretty awesome childhood, I think. But my grandmother, you know, she was just a typical ranch wife. She could do anything. She could fix up a meal for people that just happened to come by at the last minute, and you know, so whatever she wanted. She never learned to drive, so here she was stuck on this ranch, 15 miles from the nearest town, and 60 miles from the nearest hospital or whatever. Didn't have phones, of course, till the 50s. So, you know, you learn certain things about being self-reliant and you know, taking care of things on your own when you grow up like that. So she was very typical in that she never complained, ever. You know, I never knew she was widowed twice until I was probably an adult, you know. People just learn how to keep going and get by. So when I started writing, I was at first writing these stories that didn't really, you know, they were pretty good, but they didn't really get to the heart of what I'm about. And I was in grad school in Boston for creative writing, and I decided to write a story about my grandfather. So my grandfather, Grandpa Arbuckle was just, he was Scotch. He was very, very funny, had a real dry sense of humor. And apparently he was a horrible driver. So one day he borrowed his neighbor's big flatbed truck for some reason. He goes over there, he's backing out of the guy's property, runs over 2 of his sheep and kills them, and knocks the mailbox over. Well, he doesn't notice. So he just drives off. And, you know, when he goes to return the truck, the guy doesn't say anything, but he's acting pretty cold, you know. And so my grandpa's wondering what the heck's going on. Well, you know, eventually he found out, but I just always thought that was a hilarious story about how people avoid conflict or confrontation in ranch communities a lot of times. So I wrote that story, and it was almost like it opened a faucet up inside me as far as being able to find my voice and actually write about what I know. So while I was in Boston, I got to do an internship at the Atlantic Monthly, and the fiction editor there would read all my stories and give me feedback on them. So that was nice. It was a good way to get some guidance from somebody who was pretty well known. And so I was giving him these stories, and I somehow got inspired to start writing a novel based on my grandfather's life on that ranch. And the reason I wanted to do that was because I was thinking so much about my grandmother and what she went through during her life, and how, those people endured way more hardship than I ever had. And here I was going through a divorce and feeling sorry for myself, feeling like my life was pretty hard, but I was going to, I was in recovery by then, so I was going to meetings. I had therapists, I had all these resources, they didn't have any of that. So it just made me wonder, how the heck did they get through all that and just keep going, and still have pretty amazing attitudes about it too. So I wanted to try to capture that. And so I started this novel, and I sent the first couple of chapters to my editor friend there at the Atlantic, and he called me into his office, and he says, "How far are you with this thing?" And I told him I'd just written those 2 chapters, and he goes, "Well, I think this is pretty good. So, when you get to 100 pages, why don't you send them to me, and I'll see if I can find you a publisher. I want to help you get this published." And of course, I'm just thrilled. I'm flying high. It's my big break. I'm going to be rich and famous any day now, right? Well, I got a pretty rude awakening about that. He was really nice about it. He sent it to a lot of publishers, but nobody bought it. And, this took several years because he was an old school guy who just sent it to one place at a time. So I got pretty discouraged, but just having this guy believe in me was a pretty big deal. So anyway, I kept writing, and eventually 11 years later, I got published, and that was the book. So this book starts with my grandfather's older brother, the oldest son in his family, drowned when my grandfather was 14. He drowned in the Little Missouri River, which you've ever seen is, pretty tiny, so it's kind of hard to imagine anyone drowning in it, but, of course, in the spring runoff, it was a little more rapid. So they were trying to, I guess, they had a raft, and they were trying to take some corn across the river, and he fell in. They didn't find him until the next fall, or I guess it was in the fall that he drowned, and they didn't find him until spring. Anyway, I started the novel with that, and I'm just going to read the introduction here to give you an idea what this book is about. I read somewhere years ago that Montana is Spanish for mountain or mountainous. As a native of eastern Montana, I'd venture to guess that Mr. Ashley, the man who suggested this name for our state, never traveled east of Billings. If he had, he wouldn't have seen anything resembling a mountain. What Mr. Ashley would have seen instead is a fraternal twin to its other half, a rolling expanse of land that shares little or nothing with its western sibling, besides the same birth date. While western Montana rises up like the front end of a head-on collision with Idaho, our half lies quietly dramatic, its treeless knolls and dry gullies, twisting and rippling for miles in every direction. Carter County, my county, forms the far southeast corner, sprawling like an old wool blanket spread carelessly across the ground, complete with ridges, wrinkles, hollows, and an occasional hole. The closest thing Carter County can claim to a mountain is the Buttes, a series of sandstone flat tops that look like the beginnings of a mountain. As though some ambitious fellow came along and started building a mountain range, but didn't have the energy to finish. The Finger Buttes cross the county at an angle south to northwest, like giant stones laid out to keep the wind from blowing the blanket away. But back to Mr. Ashley, I understand his mistake. He had obvious reasons. For one thing, Montana is a damn fine name. It's a noble sounding name that rings especially full and rich when spoken by a man with a deep voice and a steady character. And it's impossible to deny that the mountains cluttering western Montana are magnificent. Maybe the only creation that can crowd into the perfection of a blue sky and improve on it. But despite all that, I prefer the prairie, mainly because I've lived my whole life here. But there's more to it than that. When I finally had a chance to see the Rocky Mountains, they affected me in a way I didn't expect. I was still a young man, 23. My older brother Jack and I drove to Bozeman in the spring of 25 to buy some oak flooring for the big house my folks were building. And on that clear spring day, we rounded the curve into the Bozeman Pass, and I'd never seen anything so beautiful. There those mountains sat, blue, purple, and surprising, like two black eyes. Up until then, I hadn't seen any ground higher than the Black Hills. My glances at the sky were brief, just long enough to figure out what kind of weather we could expect. So my neck wasn't used to holding my head at the angle required. Jack and I stared for 15 minutes, rotating, squinting into the bright sun. We paid the price later too, with necks so stiff we had to sleep without pillows, but it was well worth it. We decided to get closer, so we drove until the two-rut road ended, gawking. We climbed from the flatbed and stared a while longer. Let's climb the damn thing, I said. Jack, in a rare moment of skepticism, peered up at the rising slope of pine, his eyes small and dark. It looked as if we could reach out and brush our hands across the tops of the trees. I don't know, Blake, I think it's a little further than it looks. Ah, come on, let's climb. He gave in, but he proved to be right. Just as our necks weren't used to bending backward, our legs weren't prepared for ground that pushed back. We didn't make it far before we had to rest our cramping calves. I could barely breathe. I began to feel a little stifled up there. I don't know if there's a special shoe for this type of thing, but if there is, I bet it doesn't look anything like a cowboy boot, I said. Jack laughed, and although his smile quickly faded, he seemed more relaxed than he had in years. Something about being up in the middle of those trees affected him in a different way than it did me. And for a brief moment, I thought about asking him about all the things I wanted to know. Now that he was the oldest, he was the natural heir. And because he'd spent so much time away, I had more time invested in the ranch, and I wanted to know whether he planned to take over. I even felt like I had a case for taking over the ranch, but we had never discussed it, just as we had never discussed any of this with our father. For that tiny moment, that conversation seemed possible, but I hesitated, and that was all the time it took for those small dark eyes to narrow and for his thin lips to purse. He sighed and he looked away, and I could feel him drift, and I knew it was too late. So the publication of this book was, just such a big thrill for me, of course. And it was a major publisher, so I was especially thrilled. And I sort of expected that was going to be my life from now on, having, things go easy, but that's not how it works in the publishing world. So, ever since then, I've been fortunate to get several books published, but I always have to find a new publisher each time I finish a new book. And, I've been fortunate to be able to write what I want rather than sort of get pigeonholed into a certain type of book. But I ended up writing 3 books based on this, our family. And somewhere along the line, so I have this uncle who just passed away about 6 years ago. He was my mother's youngest brother. And he was kind of a mentor to me. He grew up on that ranch in the middle of nowhere, but he went on to go to Dartmouth and joined the Peace Corps and did a lot of worldly things that a lot of people in that region don't do. So I kind of looked up to him, and he liked to help me out, give me advice every now and then. And one of the things he suggested to me was, after my book came out, he says, you know what you should do sometime is drive around to every county in Montana and write about it. Like, yeah, that sounds great. It sounds amazing. So I happened to be dating this woman who was an editor at the time. And so I told her about this idea. She said, nobody would buy that book. So I decided, since she was the expert, that I would table that idea. And of course, I was living in San Francisco too at the time, so it wasn't a very practical idea. But when I moved back to Montana in 2007, I just published one of my other novels with a publisher out of Bozeman. And I told my editor there about this idea of going to all the counties. He says, oh man, I would publish that. So apparently she was wrong. But, you know, having him give me that green light was just such a great boost. So yeah, I started on my journey and did I did 4 loops around the state. I did the western part of the state first. And I would always go to the county seat and always start with the museum, where, you know, people were incredibly helpful about giving me ideas about who I should talk to, what I should go see. One of my favorite stories about that actually happened just down the road here at Stanford. I went into the museum there, and there was an older woman behind the counter, and said, so I'm going to every county and talking to people, and just try to find out what interesting things about each county. She says, well, you're not gonna find anything here. So, anyway, once I had done my tour, I did the western part, then I did the High Line in one big loop. And then I did the sort of a swirly thing around the middle of the state. And then I toured the southeast corner and came back and just read a bunch of stuff about the history of Montana and sort of grouped it together into each chapter focuses on a certain industry. So there's a chapter about ranching, a chapter about the railroad, chapter about farming, mining, of course. And so I'll read the beginning of this book. Came out in 2016, so it was kind of an interesting time. You know, there wasn't quite the political divisiveness that we see now. So I didn't really have any bad experiences on my drive around Montana. It was really amazing how people were just so willing to talk about anything that was going on in their lives. You know, people love to talk about their lives. So I have a secret to share with you about this whole Montana mystique, the magic of this place. I've lived in 12 different states in the past 30 years, and I've always been amazed by how people respond when they hear you're from Montana. Not always, of course. Some people don't even know where Montana is. They sometimes know it's somewhere near Canada, but others see it as just another small part of the big empty space between New York and California. But it happened so many times where I came across people who would say, oh, I love Montana. Have you been there, I would ask? No, but it looks so beautiful in the pictures. I've always wanted to go. And of course, there are the inevitable questions, sometimes entirely baffling. A friend of mine was recently asked, do you guys have grocery stores there? Montana is a place whose vast expanses are really impossible to comprehend until you've been here. I was recently talking to someone who works at the wind farms in Wheatland County, and he told me about the owner of the company coming out from Chicago to visit the work site. He said he was gonna catch a cab from the airport in Billings. I said, I don't think you wanna do that. So he asked me whether there was a train, and I said, no, I'll tell you what, I'll just come and pick you up. Another friend tells a story about when he first moved to Montana and he had to drive to Great Falls for business. So this guy was giving me directions and he says, turn left at Eddie's Corner. And I asked him what that was and he said, oh, it's just a gas station. I thought, wait, I'm driving over 200 miles to get to this town and I'm supposed to pick out one gas station to know where to turn? But of course, when I got to Eddie's Corner, it made complete sense. For decades, the West, and Montana in particular, has developed a reputation as a place where you can start over. You can create a whole new persona, become the person you've always wanted to be. The kind of place where a week-long trip to one of the more picturesque locales fuels the imagination. The fresh air, the huge sky, and the wide open space instills in you a belief that anything is possible. It's a place where starting over can move from a concept to reality in the course of a walk around Bozeman or a drive along Flathead Lake. Guess a lot of people have figured that out in the last few years, huh? But here's the secret. The secret is that we Montanans are completely bipolar. That's right, we're up and down like a goddamn bucking horse. Not all of us, of course, but as a state. As one big entity, we are completely manic depressive. Why do I say that? Well, in February of 2014, Gallup did a survey to determine the happiest states in America, and Montana finished #1. Wow. That's the image most people have, right? This idea that you can get, it's the idea you get when you visit Montana. People are friendly as hell. They really do seem happy. You rarely get that shiver up your spine where their friendliness seems to be hiding some ulterior motive. But here's the other side of it. That same year, 2014, several studies listed Montana in the top 3 for suicide. And for the last 40 years, we've been in the top 5 every single year. So what does that mean? How is that possible? How can a place that's the happiest in the whole country have that margin? Well, that's one of the many things I wanted to address in this book. For one thing, there's an inherent pressure when you live in Montana to be happy. Seriously, if you can't be happy here, what's wrong with you? But of course, it's way more complicated than that. Much of the explanation goes back to the very beginning, when Montana first came into being, or at least the current form, when it was settled. From the start, the narrative about our history has been altered or often completely rewritten in order to support the actions of certain people or certain groups of people. From the start, those who wrote our history were so intent on shining a bright light on Montana that they ignored many of the pertinent facts, particularly the shadows. And perhaps the most troubling aspect of this is that many of those who wrote or made movies about the West, and particularly about Montana, didn't even live here. From the time Owen Wister came out with The Virginian, which is considered the first great Western, writers have been presenting the stereotypical Westerner as stoic, self-contained, multi-talented, and completely cool under pressure. But Wister was a lawyer from back east, a law school friend of Teddy Roosevelt's, who came west a few times as a rich tourist. The American West was built around these misconceptions. And although most of us who live here know this by now, especially after decades of wonderful historians digging in deep enough to tell the real story, many of these misconceptions still persist, not only here, but all over the world. They become an important part of the American culture, and they still justify certain behaviors. They romanticize the idea that men who ride into town and take care of business are the kind of men we need. When I moved back to Montana in 2007, I realized 2 very important things. The first was that after 25 years away, I was exceedingly grateful to be home. In the time I'd been away, it had become apparent that Montana is one of the few places in the country that inspires a powerful sense of identity and an undying sense of loyalty in its people. It was not unusual for that 25-year period for me to meet someone, and after talking for a few minutes to have this strong instinct about them, only to find out they were from Montana. These meetings were inevitably followed with a big smile and a comment like, I knew there was something I liked about you. Many wonderful journalists and historians have told this story before, and this is intended as just one more contribution to the growing narrative about this place. It's just one man's take on the contradictions and the complexities that are Montana, because a story this big and complicated needs to be told over and over again. So just to touch on the sort of the emotional aspect of living here. That uncle that I was talking about, my mentor, the last few years he was alive, he decided to write his memoirs, and he asked me to help him. And so of course I learned a lot about our family and a lot about him. But there was one story in particular that he told me. We were getting close to the end of this book, and he told me this story that just gutted me. And, you know, I knew before that when he was 10, he and a cousin of his were out riding around on the ranch in a hot summer day. And they decided to get off their horses and go swimming in one of the reservoirs. And my grandfather had told them many times before, you know, you never, ever swim in that reservoir. But they were hot, you know, kids. So they stripped down and dove in, and George, the older cousin, was 12, but he had a weak heart, but he was also just not a very strong swimmer. So he started to struggle. There was no bank, basically it just, you know, dropped straight down. And Lee went over and told him to grab his leg and he would swim to shore. And of course, he started to pull Lee under, so he had to jerk free, and, you know, George drowned. So he had told me that story before, but this was the part he'd never told me. So after they found the body, you know, everybody's gathering back at the house, the whole family's there, and all the neighbors are coming with food and everything that people do in country places. And Lee's sitting on the steps, crying his eyes out. And the older sister of the kid who drowned came and put her arm around him. And she said, Lee, this isn't helping anybody. You're just making things worse. Especially for my mom. So Lee tells me this story, and I'm thinking, holy shit. This must have been, you know, devastating for this kid. But Lee tells me that was the best advice I ever got. And I thought, holy cow. And you know, I've thought about that so much ever since he told me that story, because Lee was a guy, you know, he was so smart and warm and gregarious and friendly and everything. But, you know, I always felt like there was something in the way of getting close to him. And I'm convinced that was it. I mean, from the time he was 10, he was told, you know, emotions, those are inconvenient. We don't want those. We don't do that. And it explained a lot about him. It also helped me understand myself a lot better because, you know, I've had those issues myself. And then there was another incident that happened just before that, where there was the 150th anniversary of the Stockgrowers Convention in Mouth City. And Lee wanted to go, so he asked me if I would go with him. And so, you know, we go to this place, this event. And it's a big deal, you know, the streets are blocked off, there's tents and food. So we're eating our lunch and, we come back from getting some food and Lee's sitting with this guy who's a little bit older. And they're right across the table from each other and they're just like talking like, really intense, engaged in this. And I sat down and I realized they were talking about the drowning. And that this guy was there. And, so, they're saying, and then you did this, and then you drove and, tried again, and then just like they were reliving the whole thing and it was just, so it was just the weirdest atmosphere because like the minute they were done talking about that event, this guy kind of took a deep breath and he goes, well, I should get going. And he's like, yeah. So he takes off and I'm just going, holy cow, what did I just witness? And I finally turned to Lee and I said, wow, that was really intense. And he looked at me and he said, I never did like that guy. So, even in the most, probably the closest he'd ever come to actually discussing what it felt like, he couldn't do it. He couldn't go there. And, it really made me sad for him. But like I said, it was a telling moment for me as far as understanding not only about our family, but about so many families in this state, how we are taught to swallow that shit and, not burden other people. So I don't think it's a coincidence that we have a, high suicide rate, high rate of alcoholism, lots of mental health issues, and thankfully, a lot of people are doing amazing things to address that now, but there's a legacy here of that kind of just avoidance, and discomfort with going to the dark places, the painful places, I should say, not so much dark, but just painful. Painful memories are to be avoided. So, on that cheery note, yeah, thank you. I'm happy to answer questions. You can clap.
Explain how you decided, I heard you explain it one time, because you didn't start with county number 1, county number 2, county number 3.
Yeah,
Explain how, because I thought it was interesting,
yeah,
how you did the book.
yeah. Well, I was gonna do it that way, actually. That was my first instinct, was to just write about one chapter about each county. But I started writing that and it was so boring. I was bored, I thought nobody's gonna wanna read this. It was like a travel guide, basically. And that wasn't what I was trying to get to the heart of this place, and that wasn't gonna accomplish that. So I was a little bit worried about how I was gonna get there. And the next thing I decided to try was to follow my journey. So I started in Missoula. And I thought, well, I'll start with that and, just do each county as I did them in my travels. But that didn't really work either because, Missoula County, then what's the next one over to the west? Is it Libby? I can't remember, but there's just a lot of counties that are next to each other that really don't have anything in common. So it felt like too much of a, jolt to just jump like that. So that's when I decided to try grouping them in according to the main industry for each county. So, farming was the industry that made, Sweetgrass County what it is today. That's what I did. I put that in that chapter. So that worked out really well because it also gave me the opportunity to explore how each of those industries has a cycle that's very similar. You know, their boom and bust is basically our whole history, you know, and every industry that we've relied on has gone through a boom and bust period. So it was a good way to explore all those different themes and yeah, just kind of fell together. It was pretty cool actually how that felt right, and it was just easy. It was easy to go from there. Thanks for asking that. Yeah,
Do you have an agent or do you have a collection of contacts?
my publishing story is pretty bizarre. I've always told people that want to be writers, you gotta have an agent. But I've never had a single agent who sold any of my books. I've had 6 different agents and none of them sold my books. I still found all the publishers myself, which is pretty weird. I do think these days it's pretty hard to get published without an agent. But, you know, there's just a lot of examples. I mean, it's so random what they decide to publish that so much of it just seems to be a matter of who you meet. You know, this book, I mentioned earlier that I was dating this editor. After 10 years of trying to find a publisher for that book, I met her and she read it and she was the one that was responsible for getting that book published. So, you know, it's a lot of it's just pure luck. But yeah, perseverance and luck, a little combination of both. I don't have an editor or an agent at the moment.
Are you working on anything now or?
Yeah, so I just finished a new novel that takes place in the Bakken. So there's an oil spill and there's a body underneath the oil spill that nobody knows about except 2 people. So it's kind of a murder mystery sort of deal. So that was fun to work on. And then I'm also working on a memoir called Be a Man that addresses a lot of these issues that I was talking about with the emotional challenges of growing up in this place. Learning, you know, we just get so many mixed messages about what it means to be a man in this country. You know, you gotta be strong and self-reliant. But you know, a lot of us aren't strong and self-reliant. So what the fuck are we supposed to do, right? So yeah, that's what that book's about.
Did you work for the Tribune?
No,
You did work for the Tribune.
no. I've never been a journalist.
You travel out of the state much?
Yeah, so I lived in 12 different states before I moved back here in 2007. So I kind of got my travel bug stuff out of the way, and it wasn't intentional. I mean, it was kind of weird how that happened. I didn't plan to move around a lot, it just sort of happened that way, but I got to live in a lot of cool places, so I've kind of been happy to be back in Montana and sort of content to just stay here. But yeah, occasionally I go. I have my son lives in California, and my sister lives in California, so I go back there quite a bit. But yeah.
Would you consider yourself a successful author? How are you doing?
Well, you know, I make a living at it, and you know, there's not many people that can say that. So, but it's not on the books mostly. You know, I don't get enough royalties for my books to make a living, but I write a column for an online publisher twice a month. I teach writing workshops online, and I do a radio show for Yellowstone Public Radio. So I get paid for all these little things that just,
You're scrambling like the rest of us.
exactly, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm pretty lucky actually, to be able to say that I can kind of make a living at this stuff.
So what is the next thing, do you think that will be, I don't know, abused in the state? I mean.
Oh,
there's the mining and
boy,
there's
that's a
the
good
timber
question.
and there's.
yeah. So I'm, it's one of the things that's most fascinating to me about Montana is how we've always had this battle between the people that are sincerely trying to create jobs for people in the state and the people who are trying to exploit the people of our state and, just make enough money to get rich and then bolt. We have a long history of that. So, yeah, I mean, the most recent one, of course, is the Bakken, the oil, and there's been stories about, shenanigans up there. But it seems like now a big part of it is gonna be this just huge influx of people building small ranchettes, and selling them for the prices, of course, as you guys know, and especially in Gallup County and down in the Paradise Valley and that part and up by Kalispell have just gone insane. So it feels like that's the next big exploitation avenue that's gonna make a lot of people rich and make a lot of Montanans really miserably poor.
That's what we've seen here is, I talked to different library directors around the state.
Yeah.
But, those places that you mentioned, they are getting out of state people, but it seems like we are getting more of the people who are from those areas
Oh,
that want, so we get people out of the Alton Valley and people from Kalispell.
sure, yeah, I bet. Yeah,
So, cause even, and then like Showdown up there has seen such increased traffic because the bigger resorts
Mhm.
are getting more like out of state people coming in, and so
yeah,
better to drive to Showdown,
right.
which then makes it harder for the people that are close in.
Mhm. Yeah. It's been a constant source of conflict, I think, and it probably always will be. It's just, it's something that we have to keep trying to address in whatever way we can, I think.
Was there a county you visited for the book that you thought, oh, this is not gonna be a great place, and then you left,
Yeah.
like it kind of blew you away?
Yeah, well, this was one of them. I had never been to Fort Benton before.
And I brought him.
Yeah, so it was, I was really surprised how much I love this town. And Lewistown was another one. I had never been to Lewistown before, and that's just such a pretty little town. The main street is so picturesque and, people are pretty growing. Yeah, it is. But it's still a little bit of a well-kept secret compared to some of the other small, like Livingston is no longer charming. But yeah, those were two. And Libby actually surprised me a lot. I had never been up there. And I didn't realize there was a part of Montana that looks so much like, eastern or western Washington. So that was, I was also surprised. That is the lowest elevation in the state. What? It doesn't make sense, but it's, yeah.
Troy. All those places,
Yeah.
Jake.
Where the river runs into Idaho.
Yeah, is that right?
Yeah,
Huh,
Yeah.
that's fascinating.
they go the best.
Guess
part.
which the highest per capita income is? This might have changed since,
And that's Madison County,
no,
it used to be.
could be. I mean, this was a while ago that I did my research, so. Any other guesses? Stillwater, the mine, yeah. But yeah, I think Madison was maybe number 2 when I was doing my
Because
research.
Madison butts up against the back of Big Sky and stuff. They
Yeah.
have a lot of, there just are a lot of,
Yeah,
there's a lot of money in Madison County.
definitely. lots of part-timers.
I was the archaeologist for the Gallup National Forest
Ah,
in '79. And I would hang out with the geologist, and he was investigating the Stillwater complex.
oh,
And the rocks he had on his desk were awesome.
oh, I bet.
Just, and then this happened, and this happened, and then 1.2 billion years ago, this, and then the lake went this way, and
Hmm,
yeah, it was amazing.
that must have been amazing, yeah. I can't remember, what's the main thing they mine there? It's something that, it's
Palladium.
like the only, yeah, the
Palladium.
only place in the
Platinum palladium.
country. Yeah,
It was a 1.2 billion year old lake that was 22 miles across, that had something growing in it that accumulated platinum. And then over the last 1.2 billion years, it got set up on its side, so the ore body is 22 miles long and 7 inches wide.
hmm, wow. Huh, and they were just sitting there waiting for that to happen.
The archaeologist that had the contract to survey that, because it's a government project and there's government archaeology has to be done, he did it in the afternoon in a helicopter.
Huh,
And the contour line, 1,700 feet from top to bottom, 4 of those in a mile at 22 miles. And he took his money and went out and bought 2 motorcycles. And then the landscape architect, who both went to the Gallup National Forest, disavowed his contract, and he had to walk that whole thing. So, yeah, it was pretty funny. We don't, none of us like that archaeologist.
see why?
So you still travel for your radio?
Not as much as I used to, yeah, I kind of shifted my focus on the radio show from interviews to the history, so I've been telling stories, like significant events from our history. So yeah, I told the story of the big burn and the big fire in the speculator mine in Bozeman, stuff like that, things that really shaped our history.
Who is your favorite Montana author?
Well, probably Deborah Magpie Erling, actually. Has anyone read her?
Yeah, we have her book here, we're doing it.
Okay, well, she's a Missoula writer, she's native, and her first book was called Perma-Red, and it was just an incredible novel. That was actually based on her aunt, who was kind of a mess. And then she didn't publish anything for a long time, but she just came out with a book last year called The Lost Journals of Sacagawea. Won the Montana Book Award, and it's actually nominated for, I can't remember which major national award, but she's good, she's really good. I also like Mr. Doig, and I'm a big fan of River Runs Through It. So yeah, a lot of the big names are people I admire. I have a good story about Ivan Doig. When this book was about to come out, the publicist told me, you know, you gotta get blurbs for your book. And I was living in San Francisco, and I said, so how do I do that? He said, well, you just talk to your writer friends. And I said, I don't have any writers, I don't know any writers. So they said, well, you know, they've got a lot of bookstores there where they do readings, just go to those readings and introduce yourself and, you know, ask them. So I saw that Ivan Doig was coming to one of the bookstores there, and so I thought, well, perfect. So I told my mom's a big fan. I said, I'm gonna meet Ivan Doig, I'm gonna go ask him if he can write a little quote for my book. She goes, oh, well, make sure you tell him that he worked for my cousin Gene on the ranch. And I was like, what? I had no idea. So she said, yeah, Gene used to say he was the worst ranch hand they ever had, because he was always reading a book. So I didn't tell him that. Yeah, he was a very nice guy. And he did write a letter, so that's good.
Is your Arbuckle,
Yeah,
is that any relation to the coffee?
no, not as far as we know. We've kind of.
Could be, but it's back there in the law.
Right, yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And if you wanna read two really good books. These are two of my favorite ones. Like I said, you're just getting open spaces and they go together.
Yeah.
And they're wonderful. They're both really good. Okay,